What's up YouTube, Capital G here talking counter traps in this video and asking the question, are we due for a return of counter traps in a big way, and are we finally going to have more of a slow pace control game that's, you know, kind of more based around like stunny type decks? And I actually would love to see that. Now, just for a quick history with counter traps used to be very big back in the day. This all pretty much started with Solemn Judgment, which was one of Metal Raiders' best cards. You could argue that it is the best card in the set, although Metal Raiders did have, you know, other powerful counter traps such as 7 Tools of the Bandit and Magic Jammer, which Magic Jammer was okay back in the day, but Solemn Judgment, much like its counterpart Solemn Warning, these were cards that when players finally realized, like, yeah, you have to pay some life points, but the card, like, so much of what you could stop was so important that the life points didn't matter. People started playing 3 of these. Solemn Judgment was played at 3 until it inevitably got limited, and when it did, that was about the time that Solemn Warning was released, and people did the same thing. They were like, 2000's a lot, and then a couple of weeks later, they were like, holy crap, I can lock my opponent out of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Every time they try and summon, I'll just negate. Doesn't matter if I only have 1 or 2 monsters on the board. If they don't summon anything, I can just kill them. And when this ended up getting semi-limited, we ended up having the Solemn Brigade, and for the most part, it was kind of staple. Like, every deck in the game except maybe Frog, or not Frog OTK, Fish OTK was pretty much playing this, and that's just because Fish OTK used Treeborn Frog and they didn't have any space for back row or whatever. But you know, 2 Solemn Warnings and a Solemn Judgment was basically it was everywhere. And then you also have had in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh, you know, some supplemental cards, some supplemental counter traps that have seen sporadic play. Things like 7 Tools of the Bandit was popular after Heavy Storm got banned, because, you know, when Heavy Storm gets banned, for the most part, you see a lot of decks setting 5 back row, and you know, one of the only ways to feel confident summoning in the 5 back row, not really with an MST, because that's like shooting fish in a barrel. Well, actually, no, it's not like that. Excuse me, that's the wrong metaphor. That's like needles in a haystack, where you MST the wrong card and then your summon gets wrecked and you end up losing. 7 Tools was used to kind of counter the 5 back row set, where you could go into your play with confidence, and when your opponent used that Solemn Warning or something, you could just 7 Tools it and be good. Dark Bribe has always historically been tied to burn, or just really any deck that likes to stall, set a whole bunch of back row, protect itself from the Heavy Storm when it was legal. And Wiretap was kind of like a new age version of 7 Tools of the Bandit. It didn't have the light point cost. Your opponent could get the monster back, but generally it was looked at as a better version of Solemn, or of 7 Tools of the Bandit. I added another couple of cards here. Black Horn of Heaven. This was really popular when Georgia and Infernity were like 2 of the best decks in the game, because the game was really revolving around the Xyz summon, and this was one of the best ways to stop it. Your opponent invests 2 monsters to try and make 1 really powerful monster, whether that be like Lavavo Chain, Gear Giant X, whatever. You Black Horn them, you go +1. A lot of times you end up shutting their turn down, and Divine Wrath it's never really been a dominant card in the meta. I'd never even say that it was a huge part of the meta, but it has been a card that has been seen side deck spots, or side deck tech and sporadically throughout the years. But these are the main cards that we have seen, and we have seen formats where these cards have been prominent. Now, if you fast forward to today's Yu-Gi-Oh, counter traps are not a very large part of the game. Of course, you have most decks that like to run traps will run 1 copy of Solemn Warning, but even when you look at decks that are heavy on traps, decks like Cleafort, like, this is pretty much all they're running. You know, they're not running any other cards to stop specifically one thing. They generally rely on the other cards that are more versatile, things like Phoenix Chain and whatnot. Now, of course, that might sound kind of ironic, because we are in an age where it seems like every deck now has its own Infernity Barrier, which Infernity Barrier was obviously the original, but then Konami gave 1 to Yosenju, they gave 1 to Stellar Knights, they gave 1 to the Zephyr. So you would think that we'd be seeing a lot of counter traps, but outside of these few decks that have their own Infernity Barrier type card, we really don't see it. And even then, you know, a deck like Yosenju, sometimes you see this card being played in the deck, sometimes you don't. In Stellar Knights, obviously it's a staple, and Counter Fairies was a deck that, in theory, it should have been really good, but a lot of the best counter traps obviously either got banned or limited. See the Solemn cards. And then the problem with counter traps was counter fairies, excuse me, they never really gave the deck enough good turn 1 plays. Bountiful Artemis was obviously one of the best cards that you could open with. Like, if you open with Bountiful Artemis, it didn't really matter what other counter traps you had. Generally, you were in a good position, because you kind of just wanted to use them as 1-for-1s, and then you constantly plus every single time off of Bountiful Artemis, and they had, you know, the Harvest Angel of Wisdom. This card's pretty decent. If it gets destroyed by battle, you can get a counter trap back, so it was kind of nice. And Vandy Dragon, it's okay. I'm not gonna say it's a good card, but for the most part, Konami kind of started supporting counter fairies as a viable deck, and after these first couple of cards, they really didn't do much else for the deck. I mean, it was nice that they were all light and they were all fairy, because it meant something like Honest obviously would hold a spot in the deck, but for the most part, this has been a very neglected deck. Now, I'm looking towards the future, where obviously we recently know that, or we recently learned that Solemn Notice is going to be coming out, and I think, I mean, pretty much everybody in the community is on the same boat, where we all believe that Solemn Notice is going to be a card that makes a huge impact, because not only just being able to stop any special summon is huge, but just being able to negate monster effects no matter where they happen is pretty amazing. But then today we also learned about a new counter fairy support card, where we have this liberating Aradne, and this card is amazing. Not only is its pendulum effect just absurdly good, where you don't have to pay any life points for counter traps to activate. See something like Solemn Notice and Solemn Warning, or pretty much any Solemn card, but then you don't have to discard cards for you don't have to discard cards for any counter traps to activate as well. This means like Divine Wrath, I spoke about this earlier, could now be a card that's very viable. Like generally, if you open with 2 Divine Wraths, let's say you were running 2 of them and you open with 2, I mean, it would be terrible. Some decks found it hard enough to discard 1 card, but discarding 2 cards, like, oh man, your opponent would have to have like Chaos Emperor Dragon or something like that, followed up by like a BLS or a Dark Arm for you to want to do that. Like that's 4 cards investing. That's 4 cards you've invested to kill 2, but now that card becomes very viable. And then of course, when it's destroyed in any way, doesn't have to go to the graveyard, you can show your opponent 3 counter traps, and then you just get to add 1. So the card is really good, and to be honest, I think it makes counter fairies like a lot more viable than they've ever been, because the last time counter fairies were even somewhat relevant was probably at the end of the Glad Beast format, because you know, cards like Dark Bribe could be very good against Cold Wave, which Glad Beast wanted to do. And if your opponent had Gryzaris, or really if they tried to do anything with Glad Beast, you could just play like Divine Wrath. So that was pretty much the last time that this deck has really seen any competitive play. I think one counter fairy deck made a top 8 at a Shonen Jump, and that was pretty much all you really saw of it. So I think that we are probably going to move towards a slower game. You know, we got these decks like Magic Specters that are about to come out. They've got a really powerful counter trap, and when I think, or what I believe is, when we get Solemn Notice and people start throwing in, you know, 2 Notice and a Warning into every single deck, I think that will inevitably kind of trigger this chain where people are looking at like Wiretap like, man, you know, I'm really sick of having all my monsters get wrecked by Solemn Notice. Maybe I might have to play Wiretap. And then all of a sudden it's like, wow, you may have decks like Serteller Knights where they're running 2 copies of Notice, 1 copy of Solemn Warning, you know, maybe 1 or 2 copies of Wiretap, 3 copies of Nova Alpha. And it's like, holy crap, you know, we have 8 or 9 counter traps in our deck. And I think you're going to see this a lot more often than what you see now, where, you know, Konami in the last couple of years, they've released things like Denko that, you know, well, Denko still really hurts counter traps in general, but I'm really hoping and crossing my fingers that these counter traps will make an impact on the meta, and maybe we can move towards a meta where counter traps are actually played, because anytime you have a lot of counter traps, you inherently, in my opinion, have like a much slower meta, because it's harder to spam the board when your opponent has these cards that are specifically, you know, they're specifically used to counter these mass special summons like Solemn Warning and, you know, a Solemn Notice, where it's just like you're not going to be able to pendulum 5 cards every single turn, because we have these things to stop you. And if counter fairies are going to be a deck that might see a little bit of play, and not on the YCS level, I expect maybe regional top 8 circuit type level, then, you know, it could give these pendulum decks like a run for their money. So let me know what you guys think. Do you think that there is any chance that counter traps are about to come back? And I'm gonna give this, I guess, the time frame by the time that like Breaker of Shadows will be the time frame that I'm talking about, not like next set, you know, not Dimension of Chaos or whatever, because some of these cards are in Breaker of Shadows. And let me know what you guys think. Thank you for watching as always. Also, do you think it's a good thing for the game?